Right. Well, it's been quite a venture. I grew up in Chicago and started becoming an entrepreneur very early in my life. And I'm going to give you an idea right now of what ultimately you have to be an entrepreneur. And that's a very trusting wife. And one that wasn't raised very wealthy. Because she had to go through some pretty tough times as we go through this story. So I started out in Chicago, and when I was about 9 years old, I really had my first venture. I was going to make ice cubes in a refrigerator with out of Kool-Aid, and I was going to beat the Good Humor Man at a lower price. Problem was that they melted before I could sell them. And then I had other ventures, and one of the greatest things that happened to me was when I was about 11 years old. That would have been 1943. They put a victory box at the end of the alley in our neighborhood in Chicago. A victory box, this was during World War II, was where people brought all the stuff that they didn't know what to do with, that didn't work and that sort of thing, and threw it in a victory box so that they could melt it down for bullets and tanks and who knows what else. Well, that box was halfway between my house and the grammar school. So every day on the way home I could get something out of there and see how it worked. And so there were fans and toasters, and there were shovels and mix masters and all kinds of appliances and stuff, radios. Then I'd get them home and I'd say, well, you know, this is a toaster and I wonder if it works. And that was the first fuse that went out. And then I'd take it apart and see how that thing worked, and then I'd put it back together, and that was the second fuse that went out. My dad's biggest cost at that time was fuses. But I was learning how these things were made, and especially a clock was very interesting because it had all these gears and everything, and I said, who makes those things and why do they do that? Everybody, you know, you buy a clock and you say, well, that's a clock, that's nice, and that's all you need to know. But who makes the gears and so on? And I asked around with the neighbors and so on and found out it was these things were made by mechanical or electrical engineers. And I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea, and that's what I want to be someday, is one of those engineers. And so I started kind of in the back of my mind, just figuring out how things worked. And so while I was in high school, I wanted a car. And to get the car, I worked at Swift & Company. I was in the mail room. And so I collected the mail in a little grocery cart and took it downstairs, and we put it in big envelopes and sent it to the packing houses all over the country. But I eventually got the car. So now when I graduated from high school, it was 3 weeks before I graduated, I applied to the Ford Motor Company for a job because I wanted to see how they made cars. And I got a job, I got hired. And I had to work for the last 2 weeks of high school. I was working at Ford at night and high school during the day. And then when I got my diploma, I could go switch the other way around and go to and work the day shift. And it was kind of an exciting opportunity. I was putting on the left front hood hinge on the 1954. I put the thing up there, I put the 4 bolts in it and a nut, and that was all. And then somebody else tightened it down the line, and there was another guy putting in the right front hood hinge. And so, but in between, by lunchtime and so on, I could walk through the factory and see how the chassis was made and how they built the brakes and how they manufactured the car. And it was really a very interesting summer. And then my family and everybody decided maybe I ought to be outside more rather than in the factory for the summer. So the next summer I spent the time as a lifeguard on Lake Michigan. And I tell you, it's cold in Chicago in the summer on Lake Michigan because all the warm water is blown over to the Michigan side with the prevailing winds. So I did that, made a couple pretty substantial rescues, and decided that there was no way I was ever going to work for the city of Chicago, or probably any city like in that case, because there was so much just corruption and we had friends coming to visit them too often, let's put it that way. And in the guardhouse and so on. But one of the things that really impressed me was the story. They said that the rookie policemen in Chicago, when they get their first paycheck, they said, "You mean we get paid too?" Think about that. That was Chicago, and that's the way it worked. So then was when I graduated from high school, I was in the Wilson Junior College in Chicago. Could not afford the University of Illinois, which was my ultimate goal. And I was taking the physics and the chemistry and that sort of thing there. And then in summer I had a job. And the third summer I worked for Wisconsin Steel. And I worked in the maintenance department of Wisconsin Steel. Not a good idea in the summertime. Wow, was that baby hot. And so, but that was the job. But halfway through, they had a strike. And that was interesting. Just everyone walked out, and all of a sudden we couldn't get in. And so then I got a job at Chicago Bridge and Iron at night. And I was a hooker. Well, a hooker is the guy that stands under the crane and puts the hook under the plates of steel as they're hoisted onto the railroad car. And the instruction, and they were making these golf ball water towers at that time, so the plates weren't exactly straight. And the instruction was that if you sense something going wrong, you get under the railroad car. That's the safest place. Well, I'll guarantee you, I wasn't going to try to race a falling plate of steel to the railroad car. So as soon as that thing started to move, I was under the railroad car. And as soon as I heard it loaded on the railroad car, and the train coming back so I could hook another plate, then I would get out. But that was, don't ever try to race a falling 1-ton plate of steel. After that, I was in 2 years in Wilson, the government requested my assistance. And I was drafted into the Army Corps of Engineers. And I spent 2 years there. And then when I left, I could have now afford the University of Illinois because I had a GI Bill. And I went there in the program for mechanical engineering and received a degree, BS degree, in 1957. And at that time, I came to the conclusion that you had to own the company if you're going to be really successful. And so my goal was to have my own business in 10 years, and I didn't know what it was. Something to do with manufacturing, but that was the end of it. So at Illinois, you are, if you graduated as an engineer at that time, they were people there from other industries really drafting you, trying to get you to work for them. I had offers from Boeing and Convair, International Harvester, and Schlumberger, that was oil wells, and Firestone. And Firestone was designing tires. And I selected Firestone because now I could see the whole product. In these other places, you just got a little piece of the action. And so I wanted to learn more about tires. And I actually had a jalopy race car. They had dirt tracks in Chicago, and I would race that thing, and I was always blowing a tire or something. So I wanted to know what was in those things. So I went there, and they assigned me in 1957 to designing radial tires. And nobody had ever heard of a radial tire at that time. And there was, Michelin had the radial, but it was mostly in Europe. And Firestone and Goodyear decided maybe they ought to get into the radial tire because it was a totally different construction. And so the old bias ply tires, when they would fail, they'd make it stronger in that area, so it held up. But a radial, if you made it stronger, it would blow out sooner. So the way I finally figured that out, and just with the engineering background, the construction of that tire had to bulge on the sides. And so I made the sides real thin, and the tire ran and ran and ran, and that was a success. And that's why when you first started putting on radial tires, you all thought they were running flat.
That's right.
But that's the way they had to run. You see, the old bias ply tires, when it went through the road, where it contacted the road, it was scrubbing in from front to back and from side to side. And that's why it was the normal passenger tire was a lousy snow tire because it actually closed up the grooves going through the running. And the radial however, was bulging on the sides because it had a triangulation under the tread, and the tread could not move. And so it had to go somewhere as it went through that flat area. And so that's the reason that the early tires, you got 25,000 miles and you were thrilled. And now you can get about, if you buy a decent tire, you get 50,000 miles on a radial. And I did that for 5 years, or about 4.5 years. And Firestone then came around. I really became kind of an expert. I did truck tires, passenger tires, and off-the-road tires into the radial format. But they came around and they had a paper that said that this is how much you will make when you retire at 65. And I said, good grief, I'm not going to work at a company looking forward to retirement. And I got to get out of here. And besides, I've learned a lot about the way things are manufactured, the way they're designed, because I spent a lot of extra time at Firestone just talking to people and seeing how they did things. And so I resigned. I said, now I've got to learn to sell. And so I went back to Chicago. I was in Akron with Firestone. I went back to Chicago to get a job in sales, and I got a job selling automatic temperature controls because I was involved in that in the Army. And my job was to, these were temperature control systems for large buildings, hotels, high-rise schools, that sort of thing. But their controls were run by compressed air. And my territory was from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River in northern Illinois. And I sold a lot of systems. The reason they used compressed air was it was you could modulate it. And electricity at that time was just on or off. But then I found that Honeywell was coming up with modulated controls, modulated electricity, and they were going to beat the compressed air, because with electricity you just had to run a wire through the building, where with compressed air you had to run copper tubing throughout the building, and it was very expensive. And I knew that the powers company that I was working for was going to be toast. And so I looked for a little ad in the Chicago Tribune, and I found this one. They wanted a sales engineer, and I guess now today I are one. And so I took the ad. And they interviewed me in Chicago, and they gave me a test for mechanical aptitude, social aptitude, and IQ. And they were probably maybe 30 guys that applied for that job, and I was one of 6 that they chose. And then they took us to Pennsylvania, which the company was in Hatfield, Pennsylvania at that time. And we came here and were further tested. And everything, every kind of test you can imagine, you know, could you stay awake during a very terrible speech or a very boring speech? All the way, how much liquor could you handle? And that was a real test, and it was amazing. I was participating at that time. Everybody had a drink at lunchtime, but not today. But you get some guys that when they had a few drinks in them, they became violent, and so they didn't get the job.
Makes sense.
You would think so. So I was with a Hunter company, and my job was to introduce the springs that they made to the Midwest United States. I headed Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. And I did a good job, and I worked it hard, and I found it just very interesting. And then all of a sudden, after 2 years, they moved me to Hatfield, Pennsylvania as a sales manager. And that was really a break. I didn't expect that at all. So I go out there and I sell a house in Chicago and buy a nice house in Ambler, Pennsylvania. Well, let's see, as I got the, I gotta collect my thoughts. Anyhow, when I was there, I could travel with all the other salesmen. And I could find out what they were doing right, what they were doing wrong. They were coaching me as how to sell springs. And I learned as much from them as they learned from me, probably more. And then I was doing very well at the company. And exactly 10 years after I left the University of Illinois, I was fired. The Vulcan Spring Company had been bought out by Amatec, and they felt that they should put their own people in there, and there were 8 of us that were fired, and that was the, now I'm out on the street, just moving there, and what do I do? And so I looked around for a job and seemed nobody wanted to hire this engineer at that time, but I had helped a friend when I lived in Akron, Ohio, 8 years before. We both lived in the newlywed apartment complex, I think that's what you'd call it. And so I went up to see him. Now, while I was in Akron, he was starting a company to manufacture, to broker truck bodies to change earth mover tires. And earth mover tires weigh several thousand pounds. And so he had to, he had a 64 Corvette, and he needed to sell that to get the money to start his business. And the thing wouldn't run. It kind of had a leak in the carburetors, and a 64 Corvette was a 6-cylinder engine with 3 carburetors in it, and they were all special, and you couldn't get parts for them. And new carburetors were 80 bucks a piece, and he didn't have that. And so I said, just leave it with me for a while, and I'll see what I can do with it. And he had to go away for 2 weeks on a training mission. And so he left it, and I got the thing running. I bought parts for other carburetors that were similar and put them in and put some little holes where they were necessary, and it ran like a Swiss watch when he was done, and he sold it. And it didn't leak any gas. And so I went to see him at his house, and he said, you know, why don't you start your own business now? And I said, well, I don't have any money, and I've got a big mortgage, and I'm really running, I don't see how I could possibly do that. Well, we talked and had maybe a couple martinis in the process. And we finally decided that I needed a factory. And he said, have you got a garage? And I said, yeah, but it's cold. And he said, well, how about a basement? I said, okay, got a basement. And he said, you think you can find a machine? And you take it was a spring coiling machine that was designed to make round wire springs. And it takes a lot of modification to make flat constant force springs like this. That's the spring that we'll get about later, and that's why I'm wearing this tie. That's the spring that made G.I. Joe talk. So anyhow, he challenged me, and he said, if you can go out of here Monday morning and find a machine, and the machines there were 1-year delivery because they just couldn't get them any sooner, couldn't make them any sooner, and so even the used ones are used up. You can find a machine, get an order for springs, and get credit for steel. I will buy the machine for you on the basis that you can pay me back whenever you can at no interest, because I had helped him 8 years before. And so I went roaring out of there on Monday morning to try and do this. This is an impossible challenge, as you can imagine. The first thing, I went up to Bridgeport, Connecticut, to the Gavlik Machinery Company, and there I found one machine, 25 years old, pretty used up, but the part that I needed out of it was all right. So I told him, hold the machine for 1 day. And then I left and went up to Hasbro in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And I walked in the door and I said, my name is Alex Rankin, and I'm starting a spring company. I'd like you to be my first customer. Will you give me an order? Well, what else? You've got to be honest with the guy. And so he said, I don't see how I can possibly do that. We just tooled Associated Spring, and we're way over budget on the G.I. Joe doll talking mechanism. And I said, is there anyone you can ask? And he left the room. And then it seemed like an eternity, but this man came back into the room with him and said, congratulations, young man, you're in business. And I've instructed Mr. Urbach to give you tooling money in advance, and if you can produce 300 samples that work by October 31st, this was in July, he said, we will give you an order for 10,000 springs.